Hello, this is Sam Gerrans from samgerrans.com. Today is Thursday, May the 4th, 2023, and today the subject is propaganda outlet on the state of the media. Now, I'm going to be picking on The Guardian today instead of The Independent. I'll be very happy about that. It doesn't matter, does it? It's all nonsense. I mean, I hope you can see that by now. And the fact that I do tend to pick on The Independent, it doesn't mean anything. It's all the same. So we're going to look at some more of this sort of homogenized tosh. And I haven't read this article. As I say, I can't be bothered to read these things more than once. But I've looked at the title and I know how long it is. So I know roughly what we're in for. We're not going to read it all because none of us can take this much nonsense. But we're going to read bits of it together and I'm just going to react to it and demonstrate to you that it is propaganda. I'm not saying that propaganda is even necessarily a terrible thing in and of itself. If you've followed some of my stuff on my longer form work on Jacques Ellul or Ellul, then you'll know that propaganda is an intrinsic part of what is called technique, and we're living under technique. Technique is a system under which all the stuff that your forefathers even thought was important, things like tradition and country and religion and family and all those sorts of things, none of that matters anymore. Okay, it doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is because there's a machine that needs to be fed, and this machine is basically operates on it just cares about efficient outcomes, and you with your beliefs and your intrinsic values, it's not efficient. Okay. And anyway, I'm not going to get into all of that because it's too heavy for right now. We're just going to look at this and see how we go. So here we are. Yeah, media freedom in dire state in record number of countries, report finds. World Press Freedom Index report warns disinformation and AI pose mounting threats to journalism. Well, I mean, and as you'll notice here, they have a picture of Putin giving a speech on the mobile telephone. So I'm not here as a sort of pro-Russia shill or anything, but you will have noticed that that RT, Russia Today, has been completely banned in the West. You'd think that if they believed in opposing views and so on, that would be allowed. But no, there's been a complete ban on it. You can't watch Russia Today in the West. I expect there are ways around it, but you can. I'm in Russia and I'm looking at this. I don't need a VPN or anything to look at Western news. No, I can look at as much of it as I want because the Russians really don't care in that way. So I'm not saying Russia doesn't have propaganda. Sure, every system which operates under technique has propaganda. It has to. Propaganda is, it's like the second pillar holding up the edifice of this modern society. So I'm not just inveighing against the West. I'm not even inveighing against Western propaganda per se. I'm just trying to demonstrate to you that you don't have a choice. You actually never really did have a choice. It's not like it suddenly got bad. It's always been like this. Clever men have known how to manipulate populations, and that's how they keep people on the plantation. And in a way, you can sort of see their point. If everybody was a philosopher, if everybody was sitting there, the sort of tram drivers and lorry drivers and people who work in cafes, sort of sitting there, a bit like if you've ever seen what is it called? Monty Python just Monty Python. That football skit where they're playing football, where the philosophers are trying to decide, Socrates and he's trying to decide whether or not to kick the ball. It would be like that. You can't have a society like that. You need a society that's in some way unified around a central myth. Well, the myths that you found natural and normal and good, they're no good now. They're inefficient. So anyway, all of this to say that what they're going to do, I can just tell you in this article, is say that some other outlets out there are or some countries, for example, are now less reliable in terms of journalism. The implicit sort of emotional and psychological payload in what we're going to read, and I just know this because I've read enough of it to have a guess, is that we, on the other hand, Western media outlets, we're to be trusted. No, it's all propaganda, including what we're going to read right now. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Let's get on with it. Media freedom is in dire health in a record number of countries, according to the latest annual snapshot, which warns that disinformation, propaganda and artificial intelligence pose mounting threats to journalism. Yeah, I expect they do, if you care about that sort of thing. But what really poses a mounting threat to journalism is the fact that journalists, well, actually there are several things, sarcasm aside, There are several things, actually. One is the internet. And the reason why this is important is because the old model of newspapers, I'm not saying they were great before, they weren't, but their funding model was different. So it used to be that the Times, the Telegraph, Independent, Wall Street Journal, whatever, sold hard copy newspapers, and people bought them and they made their money from that and from the advertisers in them. That's how they made their money. Now, if you look at it, it's all changed. With the internet, pretty much we expect it all for free. Now they're trying to bring in the paywall, whatever they call it, and all of that. But who wants to pay to be propagandized? I mean, anybody who pays to read the Guardian or the Independent, you want your head examined. But a lot of them do require it, and there are outlets that it is justifiable because they have some sort of specialist knowledge. But who's got the money now? It's not, and who's prepared to invest in giving money to newspapers? I'll tell you who's got the money now. It's the Pentagon. It's the CIA. It's these kinds of organizations which have almost limitless amounts of money to pay to have their points of view put out there. So in a way, it's almost like you can't completely blame them for being the supine prostitutes that they absolutely are. Because they have no other way of making any money, you see. So you should understand that they're not telling you that, but that's true. And obviously some outlets like the BBC and so on are paid entirely by taxpayers. And so they're government-funded propaganda. Anyway, let's just get on with it. I know people haven't got the attention span anymore. Blah, blah. The World Press Freedom Index revealed a shocking slide with an unprecedented 31 countries deemed by who? Oh, yeah, deemed by probably the people who create more propaganda to be in a, quote, very serious situation. The lowest ranking in the report, up from just 21 2 years ago. Increased aggressiveness from autocratic governments. See, this thing about autocracy... Yeah, these are sort of put into apposition with democracy. You've got autocracy on the one hand and democracy on the other. I live in a country which is deemed by the West to be autocratic, but I'd much rather live here than there. Why? Because I'm not. It by no means is it perfect here. I'm not here saying that it is, and no Russian that you'll meet will tell you that it is. In fact, if you ask any Russian what's wrong with Russia, prepare for a long conversation because you're going to have to listen. All right, there are plenty of things wrong here, but there is at least a sense. I don't know whether it's justified entirely or not, but there is a sense, especially now, that the rulers of this country have some vested interest in the country itself. I can't say that's true in the West. I mean, you look at the people like Macron, and I can't even remember his name, who's the so-called Prime Minister of Great Britain right now. These people can care less, and it's written all over their faces. I mean, at least when you look at Putin, for example, I mean, he knows that if the West gets their hands on him, they're going to Milosevic him. He's going to end up in The Hague, being Epstein. So he's motivated, and everybody knows it. Anyway, carry on. Increased aggressiveness from autocratic governments and some that are considered democratic. See, this idea of democracy, if you want an example of propaganda, democracy itself is a complete propaganda. I mean, what is democracy? I mean, let's just take, for example, the American, well, it's not really American. America's been, eaten out from the inside by completely other interests, but leaving that to one side. It was out there in the Middle East promoting democracy. Well, you think, well, America, it's this kind of country. It's got the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Well, if it really cared about all these countries, it would be foisting the Constitution and Bill of Rights on these countries. But no, it's not doing that. Democracy just means that we can destroy and steal everything you've got in a way that suits us, and call you names and put you in prison if you don't like it. Okay, that's really what democracy is. And if you look up what the ancient Greeks thought about democracy, because people say, Athens was the first democracy, isn't it? It's wonderful. I mean, there were a couple of things which are completely different in Greece. Firstly, there were men. Secondly, they could all hear each other speak across the forum. It wasn't mediated by other interests. So there's that. And also, the ancient Greeks weren't very enthusiastic about democracy. They understood that democracy was just the stage before tyranny. Okay? So when you hear people say, ancient Greeks, they were all so clever and they all believed in democracy, that's complete nonsense. And some are considered democratic, coupled with massive disinformation or propaganda campaigns. Yeah. I mean, have you lived through the last 5 years? I mean, if it wasn't obvious to you before with 9/11, where you were required to believe that 19 Arabs with box cutters who couldn't fly a Cessna in a straight line managed to defeat the American security services and defense industry and get through and take down 3 buildings in New York with 2 airplanes. You have to believe this nonsense, right? It's all propaganda. Blah, blah, has caused the situation to go from bad to worse, according to the list released by the advocacy group Reporters Without Borders. I wonder who's funding them, okay? What about Reporters Without Scruples? I think that would be close to the mark. Quote, there is more red on the RSF map this year than ever before. Oh, blah, blah. Let's just skip through if we can get to something interesting. It shows technological advances, the difference between blah, blah. Okay, here we are. The difference between being blurred between true and false, real and artificial, facts and artifices, jeopardizing the right to information, the report said. Do you have a right to information? Actually, you don't. They're entertainment outlets. That's what they are. And they're in the business of making money. You have no obligation to tell you the truth whatsoever, none whatsoever. Okay? So you don't have a right to information. Well, you have a right to information. You just don't have a right to any truth. And if you begin to try to insist on it, you see what happens to you. You see my last video if you want some kind of, some meat on the bones of that one. The unprecedented ability to tamper with content is being used to undermine those who embody quality journalism and weaken journalism itself. Embody quality journalism. Well, Seymour Hersh, I think, I'll appeal to the majority here. I think most people would agree that Seymour Hersh represents quality journalism. I don't personally, I probably wouldn't get on with him personally. Some of his politics don't really kind of strike me as particularly attractive, but that's just me. But I do think that he's a man. I mean, obviously he's never ever come out about 9/11. He just managed to miss that one as they all, decided to do. But he does have a very high reputation, but he can't get published in the Wall Street Journal or any of these things. He's been relegated to Substack, whilst people like Bell True, who is unconscionable propagandist and professional liar. I don't normally go into personalities, but I will in this case, who works for the Guardian or the Independent, I can't remember, who wrote a whole ton of screeds in this sort of pseudo novelistic format about Butcher, and saying that the Russians had done all this stuff when the facts will show the opposite. She can print whatever she likes, but Seymour Hersh can't. All I'm trying to say is, if you're going to make an argument that journalism has suffered, we would agree with it. But what are we reading? The Guardian. The Guardian. This is an article in The Guardian, which is one of the most propagandistic and unconscionable pieces of rubbish out there. It's got an article which is going to explain to you what's true and what's not. You see, that's how it works. So this itself is propaganda. That's the point I'm trying to make. Artificial intelligence was wreaking further havoc on the media world, the report said, with AI tools digesting content and regurgitating it in the form of syntheses that flout the principles of rigor and reliability. Well, I'd certainly agree with that. That's true. I'm sure a lot of the stuff that we're reading here is being written exactly, probably this piece as well, has been written in part, if not in toto, by AI. If you notice, I've got a lot of books behind me. This isn't some green screen. I actually buy books, and I even on occasion read them. The reason why I did this is because, and I started about, I realized, in fact, I've always known that this time was coming, to be perfectly honest with you, but I began buying books, and buying books by people, men generally, who are dead, okay, long dead, and buy the paper copy, and preferably printed sometime before about 1985, and squirrel it away, because the time is when all of this stuff, what's online, is going to just flush down the memory hole. It's one of the reasons why I put it on the screen, so that they can't change the article afterwards. Well, they can, but you'll know. This is not just written AI content, but visual too. High definition images that appear to show real people can be generated in seconds. Yeah, deep fakes. Yeah, that's true. That can happen, but that's not the actual problem. You see, what they're doing is they're falsely delineating the problem. The actual problem is that the journalists and the people who tell them what to do are completely owned and controlled by the alphabet agencies. That's the actual problem. But are they going to talk about that? I highly doubt it. At the same time, governments are increasingly fighting a propaganda war. Russia, which already plummeted in the rankings last year after the invasion of Ukraine. I'll just tell you something about Russia, and I'm not here as a Russian apologist or a Putin propagandist or anything like that, but I do live in Russia. I've lived here for 20 years. I speak the language. I've got a degree in Russian and all that kind of stuff. Is that I don't actually own a TV, but I have watched TV in this country on occasion, especially at other people's houses and bits on YouTube and so on. You get far more debate here than you'd ever get in the West. Far more debate. Sometimes it's actually embarrassing how passionate and kind of unhinged it is. There was a chap here called Gerrans. Unfortunately, he died recently. He was actually brilliant, and he was made for the time that we're living in. He sort of took that genre to its logical conclusion. You don't have any real debate in the West. I'm not saying everything that's said here is all above board and so on. We all understand. Especially, we had the Soviet Union, and as I've said many times, there were two newspapers in the Soviet Union. There was Pravda, which means truth, and there was Izvestia, which means news. And the joke was there's no truth in the news and no news in the truth. Well, you could say that about the West now. I mean, maybe you could say it too about Russia. I don't know. But the fact is, you get far more diversity. There you are. It's one of my trigger words of debate here than I've ever seen in the West. Ever. If you've ever seen what's it called? Question Time, which is really a kind of flaccid verbal floral dance of a simulation of discussion where we all know that nothing real is ever going to be said. The people who are invited, and it's an invited audience only, have to state their political affiliations before they are actually allowed into the studio and before they're finally invited. So you have an idea of the British public, comprising X amount of people probably with this and that kind of affiliation. No, it's completely contrived. Russia, which already plummeted in the rankings last year after the invasion of Ukraine. See, it was an invasion. It wasn't that Russia attempted for years on end to try to make Ukraine and the people and the guarantors, Germany and France, to abide by the Minsk agreements, and as NATO ceaselessly moved towards its borders. Excuse me. No, that's not the case at all. Just one morning, Putin woke up. I feel like invading Ukraine today. That's what you're being told. It's a bit like, if the Chinese decided to weaponize the Mexicans against the Americans, and then finance them and turn them into anti-American Nazis, and then start shelling an American city and killing 14,000 people, and then America decided to respond, which obviously it would, and then saying America just decided to invade Mexico. That's analogous. That's the exact, not exact analogy, but pretty close. Already plummeted in the rankings last year. Well, of course it would plummet in the rankings. Who do you think decides on the rankings after the invasion of Ukraine? Dropped another 9 places as state media lavishly parrots the Kremlin line. Maybe it does. But I don't know if that's true. But let's say it does. I do know that in this country I have access to all kinds of points of view you certainly wouldn't get in the West. But let's say it slavishly parrots the view, if that's the accusation. What do you think the BBC's doing? What do you think CNN's doing? What do you think any of these outlets are doing? The one person in America who said anything even remotely worth listening to on, as an anchor, Tucker Carlson, they just got rid of him. Okay, that's how much they care about free speech. While opposition outlets are driven into exile. Well, actually, opposition outlets in the West have been driven into exile. What do you think happens if you work for Sputnik or for Russia Today and you're working in the West? You've been driven into exile. Last month, Moscow arrested Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, or I don't quite know where the stress comes in this word, Gershkovich, the first US journalist detained in Russia on espionage charges since the end of the Cold War. I've been through this in another one. Whether he's a journalist or whether he's a spy, the demarcation is very vague. I've worked and lived in this country, so say for 20 years. I had to because of one of my previous jobs, a lot of journalists here. And some of them seem to me either witting or unwitting agents of Western powers. I'm not going to name any names, but I could see, and I'd read their articles. Frankly, as somebody who lives here, I couldn't recognize the country that I lived in by their description of it. Meanwhile, 3 countries, Tajikistan, India and Turkey, dropped from being a problematic situation into the lowest category, blah, blah. I think we'll just kind of skip the rest of this because I think we know where it's all going. It's setting itself up as the arbiter of whether it's news or whether it's propaganda. It's all propaganda. If they said, you know what they should have is propaganda awards instead of like journalism awards. They should just have awards for the best propaganda. Who managed to spin up the public's mind most efficiently. And if you notice, the West is running out of bombs at the moment and weapons to send to Ukraine to commit genocide against the Ukrainian gene pool, which is what this effectively boils down to. Whilst people just carry on as if World War III weren't happening. Isn't that a victory of propaganda? Anyway, I know it's probably gone on too long. I'm going to stop there. I'll link to this complete tosh in the description down below. Please, yes, I know I forget to mention this because I'm not really a YouTuber. I don't have those sorts of presentation skills. But you're supposed to subscribe and share. You see, because if you don't, then what happens is I just get completely lost, and then I'm going to have to go away. So there you are. That's my hard sell. So that's it. Thank you for listening. Details of where I upload to, how you can join my Substack and Telegram channel, support my work and download my books free are in the description. Thanks for listening and bye for now.